The diner floor tilted. A spike of white-hot agony drove straight through Kiera's temple. Her knuckles locked around the grease-coated edge of the vinyl table. Above her, the broken fluorescent tube buzzed. Each electrical hum drove a fresh, vibrating ache directly behind her eyes. Clamping her eyelids shut against the glare, Kiera forced air into her lungs, silently begging the universe to let her disappear. Then, the brand scarred into the skin over her heart flared to life. It always began exactly like this. Silver static crowded the edges of her vision. A crushing weight settled on her ribs, bringing that sickening certainty of being fundamentally broken. The damp rag dragged across the cheap table. Dragged again. Tremors wrecked her fingers. This grease-stained uniform served as armor, hiding the 3-year blackout in her memory. Waking up in an alley with a burnt chest emblem left questions she refused to ask. The monsters lurking in those dark corners of her mind would completely devour her if she looked too close. Without warning, the scent hit. It sliced right through the diner's stagnant rot of cheap bleach and burnt coffee grounds, wet dirt, crushed pine, scorched cedar. Kiera choked on a gasp. The diner remained completely empty, save for Old Man Jenkins asleep in a corner booth and the muffled radio static bleeding from the kitchen. No fire burning, no forest nearby. Still, the woodsy scent thickened, wrapping an invisible vice around her throat. Terror locked her joints. The raised scar on her chest throbbed against her damp shirt, beating in a terrifying rhythm with her pulse. A frantic, trapped animal clawed against the inside of her ribs. Pressing a damp palm over the mark, she fought to shove the wildness back down into the dark. Stay small. Stay quiet. Drawing attention meant the faceless nightmares hunting her might finally close in. The silence in the room stretched until it snapped. Air pressure plummeted. The fine hairs on her forearms shot straight up. It felt like standing on a bare hilltop right before a lightning strike. The brass bell above the front door chimed. The sharp chime still hung in the dead air as the glass door swung shut. Kiera froze, her damp rag hovering inches above the vinyl. A figure swallowed the doorway. He eclipsed the neon street signs entirely, his tailored suit stretching over a frame built for violence. Stepping onto the cracked linoleum, he didn't walk like a late-night customer. He moved with the stalking, silent glide of an apex predator circling a trap. Dropping the rag, Kiera scrambled backward. Her rubber-soled shoes squeaked against the tiles as she wedged her small frame behind the metal edge of the pie display case. From the cramped shadows, she watched. His profile looked carved from rough stone, sharp angles and cruel lines. He surveyed the dismal, fluorescent-lit diner. Complete disgust curled his upper lip. A black boot stepped forward. The floorboards whined under the pressure. Her pulse hammered against her eardrums. The scorched cedar scent poured off him, thick enough to taste on the back of her tongue. It flooded her senses, paralyzing her muscles. He stopped dead in the center aisle. Closing his eyes, the man drew a slow, deliberate breath through his nose. The dark fabric of his suit strained across his chest. His head snapped left. He didn't scan the booths. He didn't check the kitchen. He stared straight at the pie case. Kiera bit down on her own knuckle to trap a whimper. He started walking. The leather soles of his boots made absolutely zero sound against the cheap tiles. A man that size should make noise. Peering through the smudged glass, she watched him step under a flickering bulb. Bright, luminous gold burned in his irises, the eyes of a wolf locking onto a cornered rabbit. And they stared right through the glass, straight into her hiding spot. He stopped 3 feet away. The sheer, suffocating authority rolling off his skin demanded she drop to the sticky floor and bare her throat. She dug her fingernails into her palms, hating the primal urge. You. The word vibrated against the glass, deep and rough. Come out. The scar on her collarbone burned, reaching out toward the sound of his voice. Survival instinct finally overrode the paralysis. Spinning on her heel, Kiera abandoned the counter and bolted blindly toward the swinging kitchen doors. Her rubber soles skidded on the greasy floor as she slammed her shoulder into the swinging doors, bursting into the windowless break room. She spun, snatching the wooden handle of a dirty mop. Her hands shook violently as she wedged the stick under the brass doorknob. Her lungs burned. She needed the alley exit. She needed the dark streets. Wood exploded inward. The mop handle splintered in half. The metal bucket launched across the room, slamming into aluminum lockers. Kiera hit the cold brick wall. The ringing in her ears drowned out the kitchen radio. Splintered wood dust drifted lazily through the single flickering overhead bulb. The dull thud of the bucket settling echoed off the concrete. He filled the shattered frame. Golden eyes cut through the dimness. He didn't look enraged. He looked violently, quietly obsessed. His chest rose and fell in ragged fighting breaths, battling some invisible war beneath his skin. "Stay back." Kiera's voice cracked, but she grabbed the solid glass coffee pot off the warmer, gripping the handle like a club. "I'll smash this over your head, I swear to God." He tilted his chin, studying the makeshift weapon, then tracing the line of her trembling arms. Dark, territorial possession shadowed his golden stare. "You are a thief." He took one slow step forward, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "And your blood owes my kingdom a debt." "I don't owe anyone anything," she spat back, her grip tightening on the glass until her knuckles ached. "I don't even know who I am." He didn't care. The distance between them vanished in a blur of dark fabric. Before she could swing, a broad hand locked around her wrist like a steel vise. The glass pot slipped. It hit the concrete floor, exploding into sharp shards. The ringing in her ears spiked. The sharp crack of breaking glass echoed off the tile. The second his bare skin met hers, liquid fire injected straight into her veins. The brand on her chest ignited. She choked, swallowing a mouthful of copper-tasting spit as she thrashed against his grip. He shoved her arm against the cold brick, pinning her easily. His breath ghosted hot over her cheek. That suffocating cedar scent filled her throat. His free hand produced a thick, worn leather restraint. "Stop fighting me, little Omega," he murmured directly against her ear. Cold metal clicked. The thick leather snapped tight around her wrist. The lock engaged. The pain in her chest hit a blinding crescendo, flashing pure silver across her vision. A phantom, trapped wolf tore through her mind, thrashing against its iron cage. Peeling her eyes open one last time, she saw his golden gaze widen in sudden, complete shock. Her knees gave out. The dark concrete floor rushed up to meet her, and she finally let the blackness drag her under. The deep, vibrating hum of a V8 engine rattled straight through Kiera's bones. Cold leather pressed against her bruised cheek. Dragging herself out of the suffocating dark, she gagged on the sharp scent of wild pine and scorched cedar trapping the air in her lungs. Panic clawed her throat before her vision even cleared. She lay twisted in the passenger seat of a moving SUV, watching violently lashed rain streak the tinted glass. Night completely swallowed the road outside. Her right arm refused to move. Tugging backward brought a sharp, biting sting. A thick, worn leather restraint chained her wrist directly to the steel grab bar above the door panel. The diner memory crashed over her in a suffocating wave. Shattered glass, a burning collarbone, golden irises. Turning her head felt like wading through wet cement, but she had to check the driver's seat. He sat inches away, his attention locked onto the winding blacktop. Harsh dashboard illumination carved his profile out of cruel, unforgiving granite. He gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make the leather whine under his knuckles. A low, vibrating friction rattled his throat. A predator fighting a leash. Suddenly, his right hand released the wheel. Scarred, rough fingers reached across the dark console. Kiera flinched, snapping her eyes shut to brace for the brutal backhand. Instead, absolute, Radiating heat hovered just a fraction of an inch from her temple. Peeking through her lashes, she caught him staring at her skin. His fingers shook with a frantic, starved desperation. He looked like a dying man denied his final drop of water. Cursing in a harsh, guttural rasp, he snatched his hand away. He locked both fists back onto the wheel, stripping the blood from his knuckles. In the quiet that followed, Kiera turned toward the freezing passenger window. She tracked the raindrops sliding down the pitch-black glass to hide her trembling jaw. Her faint reflection hovered over the passing trees. A violent gasp tore through her lips. For one fraction of a second, the brown of her eyes vanished into blinding luminous silver. 2 dying stars burned directly inside her own skull. Blinking erased the light, but the raised scar over her heart suddenly cracked with searing heat. Something broken was waking up inside her veins. She had to get out right now. The heat blooming beneath her collarbone overrode her common sense. Ignoring the biting leather at her wrist, Kiera launched her entire body weight toward the passenger door. Her left hand frantically clawed the plastic panel, hunting for the latch. "Let me go!" Her voice tore from a raw, aching throat. Tires shrieked on wet asphalt as the SUV swerved violently. Cassian lunged across the center console. A wall of solid muscle and wool slammed across her chest, pinning her spine flat against the seat. All the oxygen rushed out of her lungs. That intoxicating, scorched cedar scent flooded her sinuses, blurring her vision. "Stop fighting." The words cracked like a whip in the dark, his golden irises burning inches from her nose. She couldn't break the grip. He was a mountain of heat. But the memory of blood in a rainy alley flooded her system with pure, desperate adrenaline. She refused to be a victim again. Planting both palms flat against his chest, she shoved. A concussive shockwave of raw, unexplainable force exploded from her hands. The giant man launched backward. He slammed into the driver's side door with a sickening, metallic crunch. The impact rattled the windows. Rain hammered the metal roof in the sudden, echoing stillness. Cassian slumped against the glass, his jaw completely slack, staring at her shaking palms in pure shock. Before she could pull her hands back, the SUV violently collided with an invisible wall of static. The cabin pressure instantly vanished. Kiera grabbed her own throat, gagging on the sudden taste of battery acid. The wet road outside warped into a distorted blur. The influx of ancient, rotting magic poisoned the air. Her scarred chest rejected it entirely. A violent wave of bile climbed her throat. "Stop the car!" she choked, clamping both hands over her mouth. Cassian slammed the brakes. Wet gravel screamed against the rubber. Before the chassis settled, he leaned across the console and shoved her door wide open. Kiera spilled out into the freezing deluge. Her knees sank deep into roadside mud as she hacked into the weeds, her ribs contracting violently. Ice-cold rain hammered her thin uniform, plastering the cheap fabric to her shaking spine. She waited for his boot to kick her ribs. She waited for him to drag her up by the scalp. Instead, a broad, radiating palm wrapped around her wet hair, gently gathering it away from her face. Coughing up bile, she froze. Glancing up through the downpour, she found Cassian crouched in the mud. He had abandoned his suit jacket. Rain plastered his white shirt to his chest, and those golden eyes tracked her every tremble with lethal, burning focus. He was guarding her. And that realization terrified her more than the violence. The agonizing drive finally ended when colossal iron gates pierced the thick mountain fog. Kiera slumped against the cold window, completely hollowed out. Through the rain-streaked windshield, a jagged stone fortress cut a brutal silhouette against the night sky. It looked like a prison built to trap nightmares. Tires crunched over cobblestone as the SUV crept into a dark courtyard. The engine cut. The dead silence rang in her ears, interrupted only by the rhythmic ping of cooling exhaust. Cassian rounded the hood. He yanked her door open and unclipped the steel carabiner from the frame. He didn't unlock the leather cuff. Instead, he twisted the thick strap around his bare fist. "Walk," he ordered, the freezing indifference returning to his tone. He marched toward the entrance, dragging her stumbling, soaked frame behind him. They passed through towering oak doors into an oppressive, cavernous space. Ancient dust, melting wax, and predatory static coated the air. Each breath dragged like razor blades over her lungs. Moonlight poured through a vaulted glass ceiling in the great hall, illuminating dozens of waiting figures. Silks and dark leather draped over their frames, but nothing about them looked human. Predatory eyes tracked her limp, wet shoes dragging mud across the polished floor. Cassian halted in the dead center of the room. He squared his shoulders, radiating an absolute, suffocating authority that forced the crowd to quiet. "I have collected the debt." His voice bounced off the high stone archways. "She is a thrall to the crown." Hushed murmurs infected the room. Sharp fingernails pointed at her grease-stained, soaked uniform. Kiera cowered behind Cassian's broad back, praying the stone floor would crack open and bury her. The sea of predators parted. An older man descended from a raised dais, his silver-tipped cane clicking rhythmically against the stone. Silver hair brushed his temples above a tailored, expensive suit. He projected the calm safety of a grandfather. Then, his lips curled into a smile. A white-hot spike drove straight through Kiera's skull. She dropped to the stone floor, clutching her ringing ears. The man continued his slow, methodical approach. His dark eyes pinned her to the tiles as the smirk stretched into a wicked, knowing grin. A violent memory hijacked her brain, green magic blinding her vision. Damp brick walls. That exact same cruel smile hovering above her just before the 3-year blackout. Well, well, the silver-haired man purred, his tone dripping with smooth poison. "What a pathetic little creature you brought us, nephew." Kiera's vision narrowed to a pinpoint. The air vanished from the hall. The invisible cage inside her chest splintered and snapped, flooding her veins with pure, feral terror as the monster from her nightmares leaned down to touch her face. The rough stone floor chewed Kiera's bare knees into raw, bleeding meat. She welcomed the bite. Leaning over the wooden bucket, she dragged a stiff bristle brush across the grout outside the royal bedroom chambers. Scrub out the grime, scrub out the uncle's oily smile, scrub out the feral panic from the night before. Plunging her torn rag into the murky, lavender-scented water, she tried to breathe through her mouth. The air in this corridor tasted wrong. It coated her tongue with a metallic tang of static electricity and rotting dust. Her temples throbbed in time with the angry, pulsing heat trapped beneath her collarbone. The brand seared her skin. A fractured memory hovered right on the edge of her vision, flashing green before slipping back into the dark. Focusing solely on the wet stone, she attacked another stain. Stopping meant letting the nightmare catch her. Yet, the vibrating frequency of the castle walls slowly seeped into her wet hands. A strange, unnatural warmth crawled up her arms, dissolving the rigid panic locking her ribs. The iron cage around her heart was actively rusting away. Reaching her free hand toward a tall, ancient ceramic urn resting in the alcove, she meant to wipe away the surface dust. Her skin hovered an inch from the clay. A blinding arc of silver lightning cracked directly from her fingertips. The urn detonated. Shards of jagged ceramic and dry soil blasted outward. Kiera hit the floor flat on her back. The deafening crack echoed down the empty corridor. Fine white dust rained down, coating her wet hair and sticking to her eyelashes. A high-pitched ringing pierced her eardrums. She lay perfectly still on the wet stones, staring at her own trembling, unburnt fingers. She hadn't even touched the clay. Far down the hall, the sharp, rhythmic pounding of armored boots rushed straight toward her. Rough hands yanked Kiera up by the collar of her soaked uniform before the ceramic dust even settled. A guard hauled her down a labyrinth of winding corridors, finally shoving her against a set of towering oak doors. She hit the wood hard. He tossed a brass-polished tin at her chest and ordered her to start rubbing. Behind the thick timber, a violent argument rattled the hinges. The uncle's smooth, poisonous tenor bled through the cracks, demanding territorial blood and expansion. Beneath that, a much darker sound vibrated. King Cassian didn't yell. His baritone rumble shook the actual floorboards under Kiera's worn rubber soles. The sheer, suffocating heat of a cornered predator seeped beneath the door sweep, baking the hallway air until it was thick and hard to breathe. Strangely, that burning rage didn't feel pointed at the men inside. Tracing the metal handle with her rag, Kiera kept her chin tucked. Looking up invited a death sentence in this place. Still, the distinct scent of scorched cedar slipped through the keyhole, wrapping around her throat like a protective hand. The monster holding her hostage smelled like absolute safety. It defied all logic. The shouting abruptly died. The sudden silence sucked the oxygen out of the corridor. Kiera froze, her rag slick against the brass. Wood splintered as the giant doors violently slammed open. The brass handle missed her nose by a fraction of an inch. Cassian filled the threshold. His chest heaved against a crisp black shirt fighting for air. Golden, frantic irises scanned the hall and immediately locked onto her kneeling form. He ignored the stunned councilman behind him. He tracked the rise and fall of her shoulders with total, starved obsession. The air between them pulled taut, ready to snap. Then, the uncle's polished silver cane clicked onto the floorboards right behind the king. He leaned past Cassian's shoulder, locking his dead, ink-black eyes onto Kiera, and subtly traced a single finger across his own throat. Hours later, the suffocating midnight humidity of the subterranean laundry room offered a temporary hiding place. Kiera sorted damp wool blankets in the dim light, the sharp sting of raw lye burning her raw nostrils. The rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe lulled her into a false sense of isolation. She never heard his boots. A rough hand twisted into her hair, yanking her backward. The cruel guard from the hallway slammed her spine into the sweating brick wall. He trapped her there, reeking of sour sweat and fermented grain. A predatory, rotting grin split his face. "Look at the little stray," he mocked, pressing his armored forearm against her windpipe. Oxygen vanished. Panic locked her vocal cords, trapping her scream behind her teeth. Her hands uselessly clawed at his leather sleeve, but as the black spots danced in her vision, the dormant beast beneath her ribs finally tore its way out. The brand on her chest did not just burn, it completely shattered. The iron cage inside her mind snapped with a physical, echoing crack. The human terror evaporated. Only the feral survival instinct remained. A blinding shockwave of pure silver starlight ripped out of her sternum. The concussive force hit the guard dead in the chest. It launched him backward like a rag doll. He sailed across the concrete floor and crashed directly through the load-bearing brick wall. The impact shook the ceiling. Mortar dust exploded outward in a thick gray cloud. Kiera dropped to the wet concrete, hacking violently as the ringing in her ears drowned out the crumbling debris. Stray chunks of brick clattered against the floor drain. She gripped her own thighs, staring at the gaping, jagged hole in the wall. A terrifying electrical power hummed through her veins. As the gray smoke thinned, a dark silhouette stepped over the shattered bricks. Cassian stood in the ruined threshold, his golden eyes wide, tracking the silver light still smoking from Kiera's fingertips. Gray mortar dust drifted down like dirty snow, coating the cracked concrete floor of the subterranean laundry room. Kiera stayed on her raw knees. A high-pitched ringing pierced her eardrums, completely drowning out the groan of settling brick. Staring through the jagged, smoking hole she had just blasted through a load-bearing wall, she swallowed a thick mouthful of copper and ash. The silence stretched until her chest physically ached. Cassian stepped through the rubble. His boots crunched over shattered masonry. He didn't yell. Drawing a weapon never crossed his mind. Marching toward her, his golden irises burned with a frantic, starved intensity that forced the fine hairs on her arms to stand straight up. The sharp scent of crushed pine and scorched cedar flooded the ruined space, battling the biting smell of raw lye. It should have been a warning. Instead, that woodsy scent wrapped around her ribs, grounding her racing pulse. Broad hands clamped over her trembling shoulders. He hauled her effortlessly to her feet, his thumbs pressing firmly into her collarbones. "What are you?" His voice was a low, vibrating rumble that rattled her sternum. "I don't know," she choked out, coughing up a cloud of white dust. "Please, I didn't mean to." He didn't give her time to beg. His grip shifted, locking tight around her bicep. In a fluid, brutal motion, he dragged her out of the ruined laundry and into the labyrinth of dark castle corridors. Her rubber soles skidded over slick cobblestone as she fought to match his terrifyingly long strides. Lung-burning minutes bled into each other before he shoved her through a set of tall, iron-banded doors. The lock clicked shut behind them. It sounded exactly like a firing pin. They stood in a cavernous, dimly lit library. The stagnant air tasted of dry leather and decaying parchment. Leaving her by the door, Cassian tore across the room toward a sprawling oak table. He flipped violently through ancient, brittle pages. A deep, frustrated friction rumbled in his throat. A predator hunting for a cure before the poison took hold. Retreating into the darkest corner, Kiera wedged herself between two towering bookshelves. The broken brand on her chest still hummed with a strange, radioactive warmth. Peering around the wooden edge, she caught a glimpse of the open page under his hands. An illustration showed a wolf woven entirely from starlight. Below the ink, a single word stood out: extinct. A drop of ice-cold sweat slid down her neck. The uncle wanted her buried. Cassian needed her secrets. She was trapped right in the crossfire of a rotting kingdom. Under the oak door, the hall shadows suddenly shifted, blocking the candlelight from the corridor. Someone was waiting outside. The stale library air faded, replaced by the damp draft of a windowless servant's quarters. Cassian had abandoned her here hours ago to manage the castle guard, leaving strict orders to bolt the iron latch and swallow her own voice. Sitting cross-legged on the lumpy mattress, Kiera stared into the pitch black. The silence in the tiny room felt violently oppressive. Every settling timber sounded like an approaching footstep. Why did the uncle's poisoned smile eclipse her memory? Why did green fire haunt the edges of her sleep? The iron latch scraped backward. Her pulse flatlined. The wooden door whined on dry metal hinges, slowly pushing inward. 3 figures melted into the cramped space. Dark leather armor absorbed the dim hallway light, but the wicked, curved silver blades in their hands gleamed sharply. Leather boots scuffed the floorboards. The lead assassin lunged. Pure survival instinct took over. Kiera threw her weight sideways, rolling hard off the edge of the mattress. The silver blade plunged deep into the cheap fabric where her ribs had just been. Feathers violently erupted, drifting through the dark. Before she could hit the floor, a gloved hand twisted violently into her hair. The second man jerked her skull backward, ripping a scream from her raw throat. "The uncle sends his regards, little mutt," the man hissed, his hot, sour breath dampening her ear. The fragile diner waitress died right there in his grip. The freezing terror evaporated, replaced instantly by boiling, furious heat. Hiding only painted a target on her back. She stopped fighting the cage. She let the ruined seal tear completely open. Searing fire flooded her veins. Her vision washed out in blinding, luminous silver. A concussive shockwave of pure starlight detonated from her sternum. The explosive force lifted all 3 men off their feet. They launched backward, slamming into the stone masonry with sickening, wet crunches. Kiera hit the floor, gasping for air. The ringing in her ears spiked. The smell of ozone and singed leather crowded the tiny room. She didn't feel an ounce of pity. A feral, terrifying justice pumped through her blood. Pushing herself up, she raised her glowing palms. The silver current hummed, vibrating through her metacarpals like a live wire. She struck outward, unleashing a final blinding arc of ancient energy. When the light finally burnt out, the three assassins lay twisted and motionless against the cracked stone. A thick, suffocating quiet settled over the room. Kiera stood over the bodies, her chest heaving as she stared at the dark blood pooling around her glowing fingertips. The doorway shifted. Cassian stood in the ruined frame, his golden irises tracking the absolute carnage she had just unleashed. The metallic tang of fresh blood choked the dead air. Cassian remained completely still in the splintered doorway, his gaze locked on the three broken assassins piled against the wall. Standing in the center of the carnage, Kiera couldn't pull enough oxygen into her burning lungs. Violent sparks of fading starlight popped across her knuckles. She waited for him to draw the sword at his hip. She waited for the execution. Instead, his hand left the hilt. He reached back and pushed the door perfectly shut. The terrifying, unyielding authority of the Alpha King dissolved. He studied the twisted bodies, then traced the lingering silver smoke drifting from her palms. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. He moved with the calculated caution of a man approaching a wounded, cornered predator. Raising both arms, he displayed empty palms. Kiera scrambled backward until her spine hit the freezing stone wall, trapped. "Don't touch me," she rasped, her voice splintering. "I'll hurt you. I can't turn it off." He ignored the warning, crossing the tiny room until the dominant scent of scorched cedar completely overpowered the smell of death. Standing close enough to share her frantic breaths, Cassian reached out. His rough, scarred fingers didn't go for her throat. They wrapped gently around her right wrist. He stared down at the worn leather restraint he had clamped on her in the diner. It looked utterly ridiculous now, a brittle twig trying to cage a lightning storm. His thumb pressed the metal clasp. The lock gave way. The leather cuff slid off her wrist and hit the floorboards with a dull, hollow thud. A sudden, unexplainable pressure vanished from her shoulders. She tilted her chin up, meeting his intense stare. That feral, golden gaze softened, flooding with a dark territorial possession that made her stomach violently hollow out. "You are not a thrall." His deep vibration ghosted over her lips. "You are coming with me." The next few minutes blurred into a dizzying rush, a thick arm wrapped securely around her waist, practically lifting her off her feet as he navigated the hidden, winding servant passages. They avoided the main corridors entirely, slipping through the shadows until they reached a secluded wing. Cassian shoved open a set of gilded oak doors, pulling her into a vast, opulent chamber. A roaring fire snapped in a colossal stone hearth, casting long shadows across a sprawling four-poster bed. He pushed the doors shut. His hand clamped over the iron deadbolt, twisting it hard. The lock engaged with a sharp, echoing snap. Kiera stared at his broad back. He wasn't just barring the kingdom out. He was locking himself in the dark with her. And looking at the obsession burning in his eyes, she couldn't tell who was actually the prisoner. The sharp snap of the iron deadbolt still echoed off the vaulted ceiling as Kiera paced the length of the royal chambers. Her bare toes sank into thick, white animal fur, but the luxury offered zero comfort. The residual static from the laundry room massacre still violently vibrated beneath her skin. Every inhale tasted like copper. Every exhale felt like exhaling pure battery acid. The dead assassins, the glowing starlight, and the terrifying reality of her own lethal biology. A brutal wave of nausea suddenly punched her in the gut. Skidding to a halt, she gripped the rough stone mantel of the roaring fireplace. Her knuckles drained of blood. The wild, rotting magic fighting her immune system cut off her oxygen. The sprawling bedroom warped into a blur of gray, buzzing static. Cassian materialized at her side. He didn't ask useless questions. He didn't flinch from the erratic sparks dancing across her collarbone. Reaching out, he firmly gripped her waist, serving as a solid anchor against the spinning floorboards. "Don't!" she choked, hacking up a dry, painful cough as she tried to shove his solid chest away. "I'll burn you. The magic is completely wild." He ignored the warning. Wrapping a thick arm around her spine, he pulled her flush against his torso. The radiating, absolute heat of his skin cut straight through her violent shivers. "Let it burn, Kiera," he murmured directly against her temple. His voice was a low, vibrating friction that rattled her aching ribs. "I am not afraid of your fire." The fight drained out of her legs. She slumped against his shirt, her trembling fingers twisting blindly into the bloody, ruined fabric of his collar. It defied all logic that the most lethal predator in this fortress felt like a protective bunker. Without breaking the silence, he lifted a scarred, calloused palm. He pressed it flat against the broken, searing brand over her heart. Kiera sucked in a sharp breath. She braced for the agonizing bite of the cage. She waited for the punishment that always followed her waking power. Instead, his touch acted as an absolute shield. The blinding, white-hot agony instantly melted into a deep, radiating warmth. For the first time in 3 years, the sickening pressure behind her eyes vanished. The roaring in her ears faded into the soft crackle of the hearth. Staring up into his glowing, predatory irises, a terrifying truth locked into her bones. She never wanted him to let go. But drawing a line in the sand always summons the wolves. That fragile electric quiet fractured the second a brutal fist hammered against the bedroom doors. Kiera violently shoved backward, breaking Cassian's grip. The sudden separation sent a cold shock up her spine as the thick oak panels rattled on their iron hinges. "By order of the Royal Tribunal!" a harsh, barking voice demanded from the corridor. "Hand over the murderous thrall." The uncle's executioners had found the bodies. Cassian didn't hesitate. Snatching a thick, fur-lined cloak from a carved wooden chair, he swung the material directly over Kiera's shivering shoulders. The wool smelled fiercely of crushed pine and scorched cedar, completely cloaking her terror in his dominant territorial scent. Locking his fingers around her wrist, he dragged her away from the door and shoved open the towering glass panes leading to the stone balcony. Freezing, bitter wind bit into her cheeks. Down below, the courtyard was a sea of violence. Hundreds of armored lichen guards packed the cobblestone, holding blazing pitch torches that painted the towering castle walls in jagged, dancing orange light. Standing at the very front of the mob, the uncle leaned on his polished silver cane, the metal gleaming sharply in the firelight. "Give her up, nephew." The older man's voice carried upward, laced with venomous, sickening triumph. "She slaughtered 3 of my best guards. She is a feral monster." The crackle of burning pitch filled the dead air. Kiera dug her fingernails into the freezing iron railing, the icy metal biting her palms. The suffocating hatred radiating from the mob below threatened to crush her lungs. She was a weapon. Her mere existence brought nothing but blood to these stones. Cassian stepped up to the railing, perfectly eclipsing her small frame with his broad back. He offered no compromise. He offered no explanation. "She is no thrall." His absolute, unyielding alpha command rolled over the courtyard like a concussive shockwave. "She is under my direct, ancient protection. Any hand raised against her is a hand raised against your king." A terrifying, breathless silence slammed down over the mob. Not a single torch shifted. Not a single boot scraped the stone. Kiera stared at the tense muscles of his back, her vision blurring. He had just declared open war on his own bloodline to shield a broken, nameless stray. The fierce, desperate loyalty taking root in her chest scared her more than the assassin's blades. The match was struck. The explosion was coming. Retreating from the bitter balcony wind, the suffocating heat of the roaring hearth offered Kiera zero comfort. She perched on the very edge of the sprawling mattress, clutching the edges of his cedar-scented cloak. Across the rug, Cassian stared dead into the crackling orange flames from a leather armchair. The quiet in the room stretched until her eardrums physically ached, interrupted only by the pop of burning sap. She finally forced the words past the lump in her throat. "Why did you do that out there?" she rasped, studying the dried blood flaking off her fingernails. "You just turned your entire court against you." "For me." Cassian dragged a rough palm over his jaw, the friction loud in the quiet room. The invincible Alpha looked completely hollowed out. "Because you are not a monster, Kiera, and I am entirely sick of ruling a kingdom built on rot and lies." The raw, bleeding vulnerability in his tone was a physical blow. The ruthless king was drowning under the brass crown. She swallowed hard, offering him a jagged piece of her own ruin. "I don't remember my life," she confessed softly, the sting of unshed tears burning her nose. "I just have a dark alley, sickly green fire, and your uncle. He did this to me. He locked my wolf away and stole my mind." The temperature in the room instantly spiked. Cassian's jaw locked into granite. A low, violent friction rumbled deep within his ribs. A predator denied its kill. Launching out of the chair, he crossed the rug in two massive strides. He dropped straight to his knees on the stone floor, catching her freezing fingers inside his calloused, burning grip. "He will never touch you again," Cassian swore, his tone a gritty, absolute rasp. "I will burn this castle to the bedrock before I let him breathe near you." Her sternum ached with a sudden, beautiful agony. Searching his glowing, obsessed irises, the final wall of her survival paranoia simply dissolved. Only a desperate, violent hunger remained. She leaned down. He surged upward, teeth clashed. The collision was a brutal, desperate claiming. Cassian let out a guttural groan, his broad hands framing her jawline to tilt her head back. His mouth was a blazing inferno, tasting of rain, smoke, and sheer possessive fury. A concussive electric shockwave detonated directly behind her ribs. The mating bond slammed into place. It wasn't a gentle thread. It was a searing, indestructible iron brand stitching their nervous systems together. Her lungs pulled his oxygen. Her veins pushed his adrenaline. Twisting her hands into his hair, she dragged him closer, drowning in the absolute heat of the bond. Then, the brutal, vibrating blast of a war horn shattered the bedroom windows. The brutal blast of a war horn tore the dead silence apart. Cassian jerked backward. His lips ripped from hers, snapping the physical contact. His golden irises blew wide, flooding with pure, violent alarm. Spinning on his heel, he crossed the room and snatched the long silver broadsword resting on the oak table. He drove the blade down into the leather scabbard at his hip. The metal hissed sharply against the binding. "A border breach," he clipped, twisting the thick leather strap around his waist. "It's a distraction. They want me out of these walls." He closed the distance between them in two massive strides, dragging his calloused thumbs along her jawline. He crashed his mouth down on hers, branding her with a hard, desperate pressure that tasted like a final goodbye. Then he tore himself away, crossing the threshold and pulling the heavy oak doors shut. The iron lock engaged with a terminal, echoing snap. Kiera stood dead center in the massive chamber, her bare toes sinking into the fur rug. She pressed two fingers directly over her collarbone, tracing the fresh heat of the mating bond. It hummed, a steady, vibrating lifeline directly tethered to his receding heartbeat. Pacing the floorboards, she dragged oxygen into her burning lungs, waiting for the trap to spring. What exactly was the uncle hunting while the king chased ghosts in the forest? A concussive, blinding spike of agony drove straight through the center of her chest. Her knees buckled. She hit the floorboards hard, gasping for a breath that refused to come. It wasn't her injury. It was his. The tether pulsed violently. The copper tang of his spilled blood flooded her own mouth. His terrifying shock rippled down her spine. A furious, dying roar echoed directly behind her eardrums. He had been completely blindsided. The king was bleeding out in the freezing dirt. The uncle had finally dropped the blade. Heavy, armored boots thundered against the stone corridor right outside her door. The oak doors detonated inward. Jagged wood splinters rained down on the white fur rug. 4 lichen guards stormed the breach, silver blades drawn and teeth bared in vicious, rotting snarls. Kiera didn't retreat. She threw both hands out, locking her elbows and refusing to cage the magic. Liquid fire rushed into her palms. A concussive shockwave of blinding starlight blasted the front 2 guards squarely in the chest, launching them backward through the ruined threshold. She never got the chance to strike again. The uncle stepped directly over the splintered wood, his silver cane clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. Dead, ink-black eyes locked onto her with venomous joy. He didn't draw a sword. He simply raised his free hand. A thick, rotting cloud of green static shot from his fingertips, wrapping tightly around her throat. Oxygen vanished. Kiera grabbed at her own neck, gagging on the sudden, overwhelming stench of decaying leaves and raw ozone. Her knees hit the rug. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize the last little guardian?" the uncle mocked, his voice a scraping, cruel rasp as he stood over her gasping form. "I slaughtered your parents 3 years ago because they refused to bow." The fractured alley memory finally snapped completely into place. The green fire, the rain. This was the monster who murdered her family. This was the architect of her entire ruin. "I sealed your wolf and wiped your mind because your blood is the only thing that can unseat me," he hissed, twisting his wrist to tighten the magical grip. The crushing pressure fractured her skull. Her vision funneled into a pinpoint of dark, buzzing gray. Her arms went completely slack. Rough hands seized her under the armpits, dragging her limp, suffocating body toward the lightless, rotting bowels of the fortress. The stinging bite of raw lye and rusted iron dragged Kiera back to consciousness. She lay curled on a slab of freezing, wet stone. Hauling herself up brought a sharp, metallic clatter. Thick iron shackles bit deeply into both wrists, chaining her flush against the damp, weeping masonry of the dungeon. Pitch blackness swallowed the cell. The crushing silence wrapped around her ribs, squeezing out every ounce of fight she had left. A single pitch torch flared to life in the corridor. The uncle stood on the other side of the iron bars, the orange flames casting long, demonic shadows across his face. "Your fake king is dead," he stated, his tone dripping with absolute hollow boredom. "He was gutted like a rabid dog in the mud." She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to give him a reaction. She dragged her focus inward, desperately hunting along the magical tether for Cassian's deep, steady rhythm. The space beneath her collarbone throbbed. The radiant, burning heat of the bond flickered. It cooled. And then it flatlined into complete, terrifying numbness. The tether was severed. He was gone. The remaining adrenaline immediately drained from her veins. Kiera slumped forward, letting the iron chains take her full weight. What was the point of a survival instinct if everyone who tried to protect her wound up in the dirt? The ringing in her ears faded into total, echoing silence. The tears wouldn't come. Her chest felt entirely hollowed out, scraped clean of any fear or rage. She was simply a target waiting for the firing squad. A single drop of blood slipped from her bruised nose. It hit the wet stone between her knees with a soft, echoing tap. Only, the blood wasn't crimson. It pulsed fiercely against the dark floor, glowing with a faint, impossible silver starlight. The single drop of silver blood hissed against the freezing wet stone. Kiera stared at the luminous puddle between her bruised knees. The biting cold of the dungeon retreated, replaced by a strange, humming warmth radiating from that tiny, glowing speck. How could a brittle human skeleton trap an ancient, mythic beast? The quiet settled into the dark. A distant drip of condensation echoed off the iron bars. The sting of rusted metal burned her raw nose. A microscopic, fluttering vibration knocked against her sternum. The severed mating bond wasn't entirely dead. It lay buried under a mountain of his physical agony. Her ribs expanded, pulling in a desperate, ragged breath. Cassian still breathed somewhere in the freezing mud. He was clawing his way back. That faint rhythm grew, striking the inside of her skull like a distant war drum. A fractured memory broke through the dark, burning away the uncle's poison. A carved wooden crib. A towering silver wolf standing guard in the shadows, projecting absolute, lethal safety. Her mother. The beast died fighting, proving that violence in defense of blood was the only currency this rotting world respected. The crushing despair completely evaporated. Tracking the steady thud of the king's distant pulse, Kiera let the terrified diner waitress bleed out on the dungeon floor. Tilting her chin up toward the pitch-black ceiling, she finally unlocked the iron cage in her mind and invited the monster out to play. The monster answered the call. Liquid fire surged through Kiera's veins, instantly incinerating the biting ache of the iron cuffs. Opening the mental cage unleashed a concussive storm. Blinding, roaring starlight erupted from her tear ducts and parted lips, illuminating the rotting cell in pure white. The sheer, violent voltage of the ancient magic hijacked her human anatomy. Her femur snapped. The sharp crack echoed violently against the wet masonry. It didn't hurt. It felt like absolute feral freedom. Muscle fibers stretched and tore apart, knitting back together with impossible, terrifying speed. The iron shackles bolted to the weeping wall glowed cherry red. The solid metal simply liquefied under her blistering skin, dripping onto the floorboards like hot wax. Luminous, thick silver fur erupted across her expanding spine. Soft human fingernails hardened, extending into curved, razor-sharp hooks. As the blinding glare finally burned out, a mythic nightmare crowded the cramped stone cell. She stood on broad paws the size of dinner plates, her spine brushing the vaulted ceiling. The ancient magic scoured her fractured mind clean, erasing the last lingering shadows of her trauma. A deep, vibrating rumble started in her expanding chest, rattling the iron bars until the dead metal shrieked. That low, vibrating rumble still shook the dungeon stones as the guardian wolf stepped over the puddle of melted iron. The cell door lay warped and ruined on the slick corridor floor. Padding forward, her broad paws moved with terrifying, lethal silence over the damp grit. Above her, the muffled, chaotic shouting of the uncle's panicked guards echoed through the floorboards. The sour stench of their terror drifted down the stairwell, coating her tongue. The helpless prey had finally become the apex predator. Tracking the rotting drafts, Kiera lifted her wet snout. She dragged the stagnant air deep into her expanding lungs. Beneath the rot and lie, she found it. Crushed pine, scorched cedar, the sharp, hot copper tang of fresh arterial blood. Cassian had breached the walls, her hind legs coiled. She launched forward, breaking into a silent, blurring sprint. Wet stone rushed past her glowing irises. She became a silver missile fueled by pure, ancient violence. A set of towering, iron-banded oak doors blocked the main stairwell. She didn't slow down. Dropping her furry shoulder, she slammed her absolute bulk directly into the solid timber. Wood detonated. Splinters rained down across the grand entryway. Fine dust drifted lazily through the flickering orange torchlight. Her claws gouged deep tracks into the polished marble as she skidded to a halt. The ringing silence stretched across the entryway. Cassian stood dead center in the ruined hall. Dark mud and wet blood completely coated his human form. He gripped the hilt of his broadsword, his knuckles stripped of skin. His golden irises locked onto the towering mythic beast, widening in absolute, staggering shock. The king lowered his bloody blade a fraction of an inch, staring into her burning silver eyes as the true war finally arrived at his doorstep. Ozone and spilled copper choked the ruined entryway. Cassian gripped his broadsword, his chest heaving against a ruined shirt as he stared at the towering silver beast. He didn't flinch from the dripping claws. He saw his mate. Before the static in the air could settle, a blistering wave of green fire detonated against the stone pillar directly behind them. The uncle stood at the apex of the grand staircase, his features twisted into an ugly, feral snarl. Raising his silver-tipped cane through the thick smoke, he screamed frantic, desperate orders at the remaining Lycan guard to slaughter the beast. A concussive, deafening roar ripped from Kiera's expanding chest. She didn't cower. Retreating was a human instinct, and the fragile diner waitress was already dead. Lunging forward, her broad paws gouged deep, jagged trenches into the polished marble floorboards. Cassian charged perfectly in sync with her wild trajectory. His silver broadsword became a flashing, lethal blur, carving through the treacherous guards and guarding her blind flanks with ruthless precision. Desperate to end the charge, the uncle aimed his cane and unleashed a concentrated, toxic tidal wave of rotting green magic directly at her sternum. 3 years ago, that exact poison had fractured her skull and buried her true nature. She didn't try to dodge the blast. Planting her claws firmly into the granite steps, Kiera unhinged her jaws and swallowed the swirling, rotting curse whole. The toxic energy tasted like raw battery acid rushing down her throat. But her starlight ran entirely on ancient, unyielding purity. The sickly green poison simply flash-fried inside her stomach, dissolving into harmless, white ash. The uncle's silver cane clattered against the stone stairs. Utter, staggering terror completely washed the arrogance from his face. Kiera delivered the execution. A blinding, focused beam of pure, incandescent starlight erupted directly from her core. The concussive blast hit the tyrant with the force of a falling meteor. The blinding white flare consumed him in a single, silent flash, burning his dark shadow out of the castle forever. The roaring in the hall abruptly vanished. Fine gray dust drifted lazily down from the scorched ceiling. The sharp ringing in Kiera's ears drowned out the groans of the dying guards. Her wild pulse hammered against her ribs as the blinding silver starlight slowly burned out. The towering beast began to collapse inward. Thick, glowing fur dissolved into smoke. Elongated bones snapped and compressed, violently molding back down into the soft, exhausted flesh of a human woman, leaving her completely exposed in the center of the slaughter. Gray ash drifted over Kiera's bare shoulders. Standing entirely naked in the center of the ruined throne room, she shivered violently against the biting castle draft. Her soft skin was coated in dark soot and the metallic stench of blood. The adrenaline crash hit her system like a physical blow, hollowing out her aching bones. Yet, with the rotting green poison finally erased from her blood, an absolute feral freedom flooded her lungs. Steel loudly scraped against stone. Cassian abandoned his broadsword on the cracked floorboards. He ignored the bleeding guards. He ignored the scorched craters cratering his ancestral hall. He ignored the terrified whispers of wealthy nobles slowly creeping out from the peripheral shadows. Tearing the fur-lined cloak from his own shoulders in one fluid motion, he crossed the ruin. His glowing, obsessed irises tracked every violent shiver racking her frame. He wrapped the thick, coarse wool tightly around her collarbones, burying her completely in the intoxicating, radiating scent of scorched cedar. "You are safe," he rasped, the raw vibration of his vocal cords betraying his crumbling control. He pulled her flush against his solid, burning chest. The sheer gentleness of the lethal predator finally shattered her remaining walls. Hot, blinding tears cut tracks through the dark ash on her cheeks. Burying her dirty face directly into the crook of his neck, she dragged his scent deep into her lungs, letting his heartbeat anchor her to the spinning floor. Behind his broad back, dozens of elite court members filed nervously into the ruined entryway. They stared at the smoking black scorch mark on the staircase. They tracked the glowing silver sparks still popping faintly at the ends of Kiera's messy hair. The shuffle of expensive leather boots stopped. The oldest Lycan Lord present dropped straight to his knees, pressing his gray head completely against the dirty, blood-stained marble. Another proud noble knelt. The rustle of expensive silk echoed through the hall. Within moments, every single Lycan in the cavernous room was bowing deeply toward the ash-covered stray. They weren't submitting to a sword. They were bowing to the ancient, undeniable sovereign of their entire race. Then Cassian gently pulled back from their embrace. He studied her bloodshot, human brown eyes. The ruthless, terrifying Alpha King didn't demand a single ounce of submission. Taking a slow, deliberate step backward, he lowered his massive frame. His knee hit the cracked stone with a dull thud. Bowing his dark head, he surrendered his crown, his kingdom, and his absolute loyalty to the girl who had just burned the world down to save him. The biting draft of a dark winter finally yielded to the sweet, humid breath of spring. Kiera rested her elbows on the smooth stone balustrade, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant canopy of the lichen forest. Warm wind tugged playfully at the hem of her flowing silk dress. No iron restraints bit into her wrists. No rotting magic clouded her vision. The suffocating migraines that had dictated her every waking move were entirely gone. The iron cage around her heart was permanently dismantled. She remembered the sharp angle of her mother's jaw. She remembered the booming echo of her father's laugh. She remembered her true, unbroken name. Owning her violent past finally gave her permission to rule the future. The quiet click of the brass door latch sounded from the bedroom behind her. She didn't flinch. She didn't check the exits. A genuine, easy smile curved her lips. Solid, radiating heat bracketed her spine. Two broad, scarred arms slid securely around her waist, pulling her backward until she rested flush against Cassian's chest. The king rested his rough chin gently on the crown of her head, releasing a long, contented exhale that vibrated straight through her shoulder blades. The High Council is nervously pacing the hall, asking for the new queen's orders, he murmured, pressing a soft, open-mouthed kiss directly over her pulse point. Tell them to wait, she purred, tilting her neck to grant him better access to the skin. The queen is busy. Cassian let out a deep, rich friction of a laugh that curled her toes against the warm stone. Gripping her hips, he spun her around smoothly, crashing his mouth down onto hers. The kiss was a slow, searing, desperate claiming that still sparked with the wild electricity of the battlefield. The iron brand of their mating bond hummed with absolute radiant heat. Breaking the kiss to catch her breath, Kiera glanced down at her own two hands resting flat against his chest. They didn't shake. They didn't hide. They were calloused, strong, and capable of ending entire bloodlines. The fragile, terrified waitress bleeding out in a rainy alley was truly, permanently dead. The unbroken wolf had taken the throne, and she planned to keep it.